Following are lists of members of the Australian Senate. Members of the Australian Senate, 1901 to 1903. Members of the Australian Senate, 1904 to 1906. Members of the Australian Senate, 1907 to 1910. Members of the Australian Senate, 1910 to 1913. Members of the Australian Senate, 1913 1914. Members of the Australian Senate, 1914 to 1917. Members of the Australian Senate, 1917 to 1920. Members of the Australian Senate, 1920 to 1923. Members of the Australian Senate, 1923 to 1926. Members of the Australian Senate, 1926 to 1929. Members of the Australian Senate, 1929 to 1932. Members of the Australian Senate, 1932 to 1935. Members of the Australian Senate, 1935 to 1938. Members of the Australian Senate, 1938 to 1941. Members of the Australian Senate, 1941 to 1944. Members of the Australian Senate, 1944 to 1947. Members of the Australian Senate, 1947 to 1950. Members of the Australian Senate, 1950 1951. Members of the Australian Senate, 1951 to 1953. Terms deemed to have begun 1950. Members of the Australian Senate, 1953 to 1956. Members of the Australian Senate, 1956 to 1959. Members of the Australian Senate, 1959 to 1962. Members of the Australian Senate, 1962 to 1965. Members of the Australian Senate, 1965 to 1968. Members of the Australian Senate, 1968 to 1971. Members of the Australian Senate, 1971 to 1974. Members of the Australian Senate, 1974 1975. Terms deemed to have begun 1973. Members of the Australian Senate, 1975 to 1978. Members of the Australian Senate, 1978 to 1981. Members of the Australian Senate, 1981 to 1983. Members of the Australian Senate, 1983 to 1985. Terms deemed to have begun 1982. Members of the Australian Senate, 1985 to 1987. Members of the Australian Senate, 1987 to 1990. Members of the Australian Senate, 1990 to 1993. Members of the Australian Senate, 1993 to 1996. Members of the Australian Senate, 1996 to 1999. Members of the Australian Senate, 1999 to 2002. Members of the Australian Senate, 2002 to 2005. Members of the Australian Senate, 2005 to 2008. Members of the Australian Senate, 2008 to 2011. Members of the Australian Senate, 2011 to 2014. Members of the Australian Senate, 2014 to 2016. Members of the Australian Senate, 2016 to 2019. Elected the 2nd of July 2016. Terms deemed to have begun on the 1st of July 2016.